Hello everybody. As you can see, the ground behind me looks a little blackened, a little scorched. And that's because I'm standing in an area where a controlled burn was used by habitat managers to improve the quality of the habitat, to keep the vegetation kind of in control, to create a diverse patchwork of different types of habitats for different species to enjoy. And finding this place and thinking about fires a bit and thinking about all of the fires that are burning across the state of California right now, I thought it might be a good time, an interesting moment to have a chat about how we got here when it comes to fires, especially these big fires, and maybe kick around some ideas of where to go next. Fire control and fire treatments, especially wildland fires, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, in California really mimics the rest of the Western United States and to a certain extent all of the United States. If you go back a long time, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years maybe, native peoples were using fire on this landscape. Natural fires were starting. Native peoples were using fire. There was a lot of fire. It was a natural part of the environment. And in fact, if you go through habitats and you look at them and you look at how often fires come through those areas, you'll actually find that every single one of them has a certain fire regime that habitat has evolved with. It's natural. And it had a lot of benefits. Native peoples would intentionally start fires or encourage naturally starting fires, and do so in such a way and at such a frequency that fires in a lot of the forests in the Western United States in particular never really built up to high levels of fuels. So what would happen is there would be some buildup of dead grasses, sticks, small bushes. These plants would grow, they would die, dry out, and a fire would come through. But with that relatively small amount of fuel and the lightness of the fuel, grass burns very quickly, it doesn't really stick around for very long, the fires would never really build up to the heat intensity and also the area, the size, where they were going to be really destructive. They'd be these small, low-level fires that would burn through an area, clear out the brush, clear out the sort of small amount of thatch of dead grass or pine needles that was on the ground, and then kind of die out. And that would be that. Big trees wouldn't be damaged because bark is actually fairly good at protecting the underlying living tissue of a tree from the heat of a fire. So these small fires that didn't really develop that much heat wouldn't really hurt the trees, the big trees, and the smaller plants, shrubs, grasses, that kind of thing, would spring back really quickly after a fire. And after that fire happened, those plants would in fact spring back, and the cycle would kind of repeat. They would grow, they would die, dry out, and another small fire would come through at a certain frequency and reset the whole process. This went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And in that time, really big, catastrophic, stand-replacing fires were really rare. But they did happen every once in a while. And in response to one or two of these really big fires that did get started, the US government passed a few rules, made some policies to try to prevent them. One of these was the Weeks Act that was passed by the United States government in 1811. And the Weeks Act was great in a lot of ways. It sort of formalized and codified a national forest service in many ways, which was cool. And it has been responsible for the preservation of millions of acres since it was passed in 1911. But it wasn't perfect. One of the things that it also did was it banned lots of fire management tools that Native Americans were using at the time. So it made those basically illegal. Another policy that was created by the U.S. Forest Service was the so-called 10 a.m. policy that came around in 1934 or 1935. And this policy stated that any fire out in the wildlands would be out, or at least that was certainly the target, that it would be targeted to be out by 10 o'clock the morning after it was discovered, the morning after it started. The 10 a.m. policy. And this was pursued very aggressively and honestly very successfully. People got out onto fires very quickly and would put them out. And what this meant was that a lot of forest fires were prevented. So lots of ignition sources were removed. People, going on huge PR campaigns. Smokey the Bear is a famous part of the sort of 10 a.m. policy philosophy. Only you can prevent forest fires, right? Forest fires are bad, 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 bad. And so people really adopted this. People really internalized this to a great extent. Not just people who worked for the federal government, but society at large became used to this idea that fire equals bad. Period. Not only did it help to prevent fires getting started, but with that 10 a.m. policy, they put a lot of fires out. Fires that might have burned, that might have done what I talked about earlier, sort of a low-level burn through an area to remove kind of the brush and undergrowth a little bit, kind of reduce the fuel load on the ground down to nothing or a very small level. Those were all put out. No fires. Fire gets started, even a little fire, even somewhere that it would have been safe to let it burn. Nope, 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 nope. By 10 a.m. the next morning, it's out. That was the goal. And like I said, they pursued this very successfully for almost 100 years. I mean, it's 2021 right now. And the 10 a.m. policy is not in place anymore, but it was until recently. It lasted for almost 100 years. And so, what was the result of that? Well, like I talked about, when there's a little bit of accumulation of fuels, and a fire comes through, it kind of resets that whole process, right? But what if the fire doesn't come through? Then there's accumulation of fuels, and there's more of an accumulation of fuels, and then there's more of an accumulation of fuels, and that fuel layer just builds up and builds up and builds up. You get branches falling down on trees, you get trees falling over, and they don't get burned off at all. They just sit there until another tree falls on top of them. More branches, more grasses grow, more bushes grow, they die. It all keeps piling up until you have a rather tremendous fuel load sitting on the ground. And of course, no policy is 100%. Even something that was pursued as successfully and aggressively as a 10 a.m. policy, it's not going to be 100%. Eventually, a fire is going to get started, and it is going to start to burn. And when you have giant piles, layers of fuel across the forest floor that have been sitting there and drying out, that fire is going to catch, and it is going to grow, and it is going to be big. And that's where we get into problems, because those big fires do have enough heat to kill big trees. They are tall enough with flames to reach low-lying branches, things called ladder fuels, where then they get up into the crowns of the forest and burn across the crowns of the forest and kill off trees, kill off hundreds of trees, thousands of trees, tens of thousands of trees. This is what becomes known as a catastrophic stand-replacing fire, because it replaces the forest. It wipes out even the adult trees, and they have to sort of go back to baby trees and start all over again. The whole forest has to start all over again. And this is what we're seeing now. After about a century of very aggressive, total fire suppression, we've now built up huge loads of fuel throughout so many of the forests in Western North America and to a certain extent in Eastern North America as well. And so that's why you have every year now in California new records being set, new historic landmarks being hit by fires, where, a few years ago there was the Camp Fire, which was one of the most destructive fires and certainly the largest loss of life fires in California history. You have fires that are burning right now, like the Dixie Fire, which became quite historic by becoming the very first fire in California history to start on the western slope of the Sierra, cross the crest, and burn on the eastern slope as well. And then 1 month later, it was joined by the second time in California history by the Calder Fire, which did the same thing. Started on the western slope, burned up to the crest, and started down the eastern slope. So every year this seems to be happening, where new landmarks, new records are being set in the size of a fire, in the loss of life, in the destruction, in the other characteristics like crossing the Sierra crest. It's all sort of a legacy of almost a century of what was an attempt to be total fire suppression. Total fire suppression was a terrible idea. It has not worked. So that's where we are today. 100 years ago, foresters, policymakers figured that this was going to be a good idea, that fire was bad, and that we needed to remove it from the landscape. And that was a mistake. And they stuck with that mistake for a long time, and now the situation has gotten really, really, really out of hand. So where do we go from here? What do we do? Well, it might not surprise you that one of the most commonly adopted answers, the thing that people, professional firefighters, professional foresters today think is the solution, is bringing fire back to the landscape. Many groups are doing this. Many Native American tribes, especially in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, are doing this very successfully. They're bringing back fire in a historic, ecologically sustainable, and ecologically beneficial way. Now, you can't just jump in and start a fire in a forest that hasn't had a fire in 100 years because of all those fuels. If you just go and casually light a fire, that's going to take off, and you're going to start the rim fire or the campfire or the Calder Fire. You're going to start one of these gigantic fires, and that's not a good idea. But if teams of workers can go into an area first and using mechanical tools, bulldozers, there's all sorts of tree trimming tools that you can stick to a backhoe, basically, go into an area and mechanically remove a lot of that debris and get it down to a small level. Or where the big machines don't work, if you can go in by hand and drag out a lot of those fuels and remove fuels from those forests, you can bring the fuel levels down in an area to where it is smaller. It is much more natural accumulation level. And then when you light a fire in that, it's that low level fire again. We're back to how we started 10,000 years ago, where, small levels of fuel, fire goes through, never burns super hot, just clears out the underbrush, resets the whole system. So there's a way of getting back to that. It's hard. It's expensive. Yes, absolutely. Is fire treatment, is fire management, is vegetation management, timber removal, fuel reduction hard? You bet. It's hard logistically. It's hard physically. Is it expensive? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Those tools are, those big machines, not cheap. Does it take a long time? Yeah, you have to pay your people for a while. Doing that work requires a lot of people. It's expensive. No argument, no doubt. But you compare that to how much it costs to fight a raging, out of control wildfire, and suddenly, while it is expensive to do fuels management, it's not as expensive as fighting a wildfire. It's not as disastrous as loss of property and the loss of life that occurs when these giant fires get started. So overall, I would make the argument, it's made by many, many other people, that it's totally worth doing. And that's what we need to do more of. We need to invest spectacularly more in doing fuel reduction treatments, mechanical thinning, hand thinning, controlled burns. These are all amazingly important, valuable tools that we should be using across the landscape, certainly of the Western United States, and I would say, sure, pretty much all of the forests of the United States, all of the wildlands of the United States should at least be looked at and figured out, okay, what fuel reduction treatments should we use to bring back natural fire regimes, sort of a natural recurrence of fire on that particular habitat, in that particular place, to make it safer, to make it honestly healthier, the landscape healthier, to reduce the air pollution that's produced when huge amounts of fuels burn all at once. What do we do to get back to kind of a safer baseline? And those three things, hand thinning, mechanical thinning, and controlled burns, those are three of the big treatments, the big tools in our toolbox that we can use to help reduce the dangers of these catastrophic stand replacing fires getting started and taking off and destroying tremendous amounts of our forests. So, to a certain extent, that's kind of where it comes back to us. A lot of the policies of that total suppression of fire were adopted by the community, as I mentioned earlier. People got into the mindset that fire equals bad. We all need to change that in our own heads. We need to be supportive when there are controlled burns. The air quality specialists and fire specialists and forestry specialists figure out when there are good burn days each year, when the humidity is high, so it's a little bit damp, helps prevent fires from getting away, when the wind speed is low, so it's not going to spread embers all over the place. You know, you can find these times when, based on the season and based on the weather, it's a good burn day. When those good burn days come up, we the people need to support those foresters going out and doing some burns. We need to support legislation and policies that put money towards those fuel reduction costs. Yes, it's going to be expensive. Yes, it's going to be a worthy investment to the future. So, when you hear about controlled burns happening in your area, be supportive of those in any way you can think of. Write letters to your elected officials saying, hey, I support controlled burns. I support fuel treatments. I would support a bill that put money towards those things. Use your voice as a voting member of this democracy to help change the mindset of our communities and our leaders, our legislatures, so that more forest treatments that reduce fuels can be done, and we can help mitigate and reduce and avoid these giant fires that are burning today from happening again and again and again in the future. A little something to think about this morning. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for the view. Until next time, enjoy the natural world.